I was thinking one thing. Okay. Tiffany might need to put her coffee down on something soft.
Oh.
Because I just heard it. You can drink it as much as you want.
Take
Sorry,
one
Malia.
Mm-hmm.
No, you can drink it the whole time. I'll be drinking mine, but if you can put it on a notepad or a piece of paper. I just heard it clank down.
I just did a notepad. Was that better? Okay.
Yes. Yeah, sorry. Okay. I just noticed that. No, that's good.
Ready? Well, welcome back to our season on trauma. We've been talking about what trauma is, different types of trauma, and we're going to turn a little bit of a corner today because we're going to talk a little bit more solution-oriented today, a little bit more strategy for how to address trauma. And today's fun for Brenda and me because we have been begging, pleading, and trying to get our friend Tiff on this podcast since the very first day we started, and she is here today.
Yes, this is a really special episode for us because it is so personal. Tiffany is also one of our board members, and so we're thankful for that. But I want to share a little bit about Tiffany's professional journey and then a few things about personal, if I can do that for a minute.
Spill the secret.
That's right. Yes. Well, first of all, just to say that Tiffany's been a physical therapist for 27 years, and 25 of those she's had a focus in pelvic floor dysfunction, and we'll come back to find out a little bit about that fun job in a minute. She's also the co-owner of Neurokinetic Solutions and the co-developer of BrainPump, which is a children's group exercise class, and it addresses central nervous system immaturity. So basically, she came together as a physical therapist with a physical educator friend, and they began to talk about and deal with learning and sensory issues in children, and saw incredible success with that. We can talk a little bit more about that. She had her own private practice for 10 years, and recently has had a big transition into academia, where now she is teaching future PTs at Faulkner University in Montgomery, Alabama, in their PT doctoral program. And that's really exciting, Tiffany, because we've always said that you need to multiply yourself, and now you're getting that opportunity because we need 100 more Tiffany's out there immediately. You're married to Keith. You've been married for 27 years, and really and truly your marriage is just one of the sweetest that I've had the privilege of witnessing. I just love the way you and your husband have operated with such sweetness and mutuality and reciprocity and all the things. 3 incredible children, adults and adultish, because I feel like Nate, your baby at 17, is like, oh my goodness, I feel like he's been the baby forever. And Mackenzie and Gant. And Mackenzie, her daughter, who's 23, is following in her footsteps to become a PT as well. Mm-hmm. And so you are literally reproducing yourself physically in your daughter, becoming a physical therapist, and then the work that you're doing. But we know you're passionate about bringing pain science and trauma-informed therapies to people with the hope of the gospel. And so that's really important for us today as we really begin to discuss the idea of being embodied souls and what does it mean to bring these ideas of our body and our soul together. And so I think that's going to be incredible for us to talk about today. But I did want to say a few things on a personal connection. One is I want everybody to know that Tiffany is from Slap Out, Alabama. And it's kind of like, can anything good come from Slap Out? Well, there's Tiffany, And I think it's funny. I actually looked it up this morning, Tiffany. I don't know. Do you know where Slap Out came from? What the name's from?
I think tell us. There's a few different stories, but there's a little country store. Sorry, I just dropped my AirPod. There's a little country store called the Boys Store in the center of town, and the story is that you could buy anything from fishing bait to milk and bread there, but somebody went in and asked for some milk or something like that, and the cashier said, "We're Slap Out." And so, is that what you read?
Yes, that's exactly what we're Slap Out. And if you're not from the South, you may not get that, but that's a Southern saying. We're Slap Out. And so that's what the town became, is Slap Out. The other thing I just want to say is because Tiffany is wicked smart and wicked funny and just very personable, I don't know anybody, myself included, and every member of my family who has not had a girl crush on her. And that's just a fact. That's just a
told
fact.
you for years you have to stop saying that, Brenda.
I can't because it's just true. But we love you, Tiffany. We are glad that you are here with us. And maybe you could just tell us a little bit. I know there's a lot on your bio, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more so people understand what you've been doing in the area of pelvic floor dysfunction and also just the brain pump.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say I'm just so excited to be here with two of my favorite people in the world. And, everybody listening, y'all don't know how the real deal these two women are, but they're the real deal. I've had the pleasure of walking alongside them for 25 plus years, and anyway, just the real deal in every way. And so I'm so excited to be doing this with you guys, and so thankful for both of you in my life all these years. So so yeah, just a little bit about what I do and what I've done. Maybe a lot of people don't even know what pelvic floor dysfunction is, and they certainly don't know that there's physical therapy for it. But I always say I was doing it before it was cool. Now it's like a real popular area of physical therapy, which always kind of cracks me up. And I'm so glad. I mean, I'm just there's so many young therapists that want to do it now, and it's such a need, and it's just really exciting to see that it's almost like vogue now to be a pelvic floor physical therapist. But it was not vogue when I started it, and I always say it kind of chose me. I didn't choose it, but I was working for a company, and that a physician came into town that was not from our area, and she needed a pelvic floor PT, and nobody even knew what that was, and so I got sit for some of the training, and this was really when it was just kind of brand new. We didn't know what we were doing yet, and anyway, so it became such a blessing and something that just kind of followed me around wherever I worked, and then allowed me to really start my own practice, and which was such a blessing. But basically, if you don't know what your pelvic floor is, it's muscles in your pelvis, in the bottom of your pelvis that surround rectal opening, urethral opening, and if you're female, vaginal opening. Can I say vagina on this? Y'all didn't give me my rules.
We get personal today.
Have you had anybody say vagina on your podcast?
Probably
No,
not.
I think this will be a first.
You could have a distinction here. Yeah.
Okay. So anyway, it's certainly, I think when people think pelvic floor dysfunction, they may think of the 50-year-old who's had 3 babies and we're going through menopause, and now she's TTing in her pants. And that certainly can be some of what we see, but the vast majority of what we see is pelvic pain, and that can be from an injury, but again, a large percentage of that is a stress response and a trauma response. And so in a lot of these people's history, men and women, so pelvic floor dysfunction is much more common in women, but we see men as well. And sorry, my thing keeps falling out. A lot of times in their past and in their history is some of abuse or trauma. It doesn't have to be sexual in nature. A lot of times it is, but it can just be adverse childhood experiences, high stress situations, chronic stress, abusive marriages. I mean, you name it. And the fascinating thing is that our pelvic floor is just really, really susceptible to respond to that stress and trauma. And so those muscles are innervated, which just means supplied more by our central nervous system than other parts of our body, which is just really, really interesting. And so it's going to respond more aggressively and quicker sometimes than other parts of our body. And how that looks symptomatically can be pain, just pain with function, but a lot of times it shows up with pain with penetrative intercourse, or pain with sex, and then that just compounds trauma. I mean, it just compounds. That's a lot of pressure on one body part, and then begins to affect maybe relationships, or maybe the relationship that you maybe felt even the safest in, or not. But it becomes very complicated and begins to affect other areas of our life. It's not just like dealing with shoulder or knee pain. It begins to affect relationships more than other parts of our body. And so that's what I've really done for the last 25 years. And again, I've always loved it because it is intimate. It is it's a relationship that's different than just treating somebody's knee. And so you really do have to kind of enter into a lot of safety and a lot of trust. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to do that with people. And so that's that's kind of my story in a nutshell.
That's so good. I feel like we could just do a whole podcast just on that, and maybe we'll come back to do that. But I'm also curious, Tiffany, just to know your work with children, particularly looking at the immature central nervous systems and how that might be relating to trauma as well.
Yeah, we don't know. There's not a lot of data to support that children who have had trauma or who have been in traumatic experiences have some of these developmental delays. But most of the literature will say that they do think that there's a link because trauma it changes your brain, and so it just does. And so we can kind of see some of these same symptoms in children in terms of our brain not being well organized. And so whether it be we can't control our emotions, or we can't track our eyes left to right, or we can't stand on one leg. And so what I have seen, so my practice initially was mostly women and children. And so I treated women, pelvic floor dysfunction, and then I had just a real niche for preschool and school age children who were having some learning and developmental issues and a little bit trouble in school. And so that was kind of how I started my practice. And what I began to see is just more and more kids with learning disability and developmental delay and sensory issues. And so I kind of teamed up with a colleague of mine who is a PhD at another college here in town, and we began to just do some research of letting our worlds combine. Her background was mostly like what you would do with PE in children. She mostly taught physical educators. I was a physical therapist, and so we let our professional lines kind of blur and say there's so many kids with these issues that there are not enough therapists to go around. And so we're like, what do we need to do to bring this into schools? And basically the whole premise of it is we can watch a child move and have some sense of how well organized their brain is. And so to make them move more normally helps organize things, and everything seems to get a little bit better. And so we know trauma is part of that, but there really has to be a lot more research to kind of define that. But yeah.
But I like what you said. I know we'll talk about this later, but just this idea of movement and trauma and reorganizing the brain. So we'll come back to that. Keep that thought.
So to bring us into today, we've been talking about trauma. We've been talking about how trauma fragments us and how that fragmentation means we get alienated from our body, we get alienated from ourself, our thoughts, our own story, our feelings, we get alienated from God and other people. And so because of that, we often find that in trauma, we begin to see the world as an unsafe place. And so what we're really going to talk about today is how we're going to establish that safety, because trauma experts will tell us like the first thing we need to do is reestablish a sense of safety. And I know that could maybe sounds really basic or even abstract. So we want that to become more concrete. And what happened with me when I experienced a traumatic experience in my church a couple of years ago, I began to realize that if I was going to come back into a church setting, I wasn't going to be able to make the church setting a safe place for me. I couldn't change that environment. And so I had to learn how to establish safety kind of within myself and bring that with me. That's the way I began to think of it, is that I could bring my safety with me. Of course, any believer brings their safety with them because the Holy Spirit resides in them. But I began to think about, what did it mean to keep my body safe? What did it mean to feel safe with God and the Holy Spirit in me? And what did it mean to feel safe as I re-entered into relationships? And so that's the paradigm we're kind of going to use going forward, and why we wanted to bring Tiffany in today, because we want to talk about specifically today just a focus on the body. What does it mean to feel safe in our body? What are some practical things we can do? How that safety gets destroyed, and then how that safety gets restored.
Yeah. And let me just add to that, Alex, that I know for me in my biblical counseling training, it's probably only been the last 5 or 10 years that I've really become aware of the body,
Yeah.
which that's interesting, isn't it? Because we are, after all, embodied souls. But in the Christian faith, and I think in biblical counseling world, we've really disconnected these two from one another. It's like we know that the inner man impacts the outer man, and the outer man impacts the inner man, but we couldn't figure out how to put them together. And it really almost came across oftentimes as seeming like maybe we were going off the rails, you know, to talk about the body. In some of the ways, even we're going to talk about the body today, we really want to come back to showing how this is a very biblical and theologically sound way of thinking about being embodied souls. And so I do want to say we're going to put up a link in our show notes. Dr. Bob Kellerman, who, you know, is one of our favorite guests who's never on our program here, but is always on because we're always referring to him, has put together, collated 560 biblical passages from Genesis to Revelation on what the Bible says about suffering and embodied souls. So if you're wondering today, if we get into this, it's like, why are biblical counselors taking a whole session to talk about the body? Well, this is why. I would encourage you to download that and really go back and realize how much the body is addressed from the beginning to the end of the scriptures. And you know, and our bodies are going to follow us eventually as well. So we're, you know, we're not getting rid of these bodies. Temporarily we will. So anyway, just to really, I think, frame this conversation, that this is a theological discussion when we begin to talk about the body.
Yeah, I'd like to tell people that the very first thing God gave us to steward was a body. I mean, like he made a body and then he placed it in the garden. And so when people start to get a little nervous about why am I talking about my body, I say, let's just start at the very beginning and remember this is the first thing God gave you to steward. So
he gave us a body, I think Genesis 2, and then breathed life into it and animated that body, which means he gave us spiritual and physical life. But to your point, the body was there first.
Yeah.
So.
And I'll just add too, real quick, you know, there is such a disconnect in the medical community too. I mean, you know, that's what I've always been passionate about, is that, you know, don't forget that this body that you're treating as a physical therapist also has a soul and a heart and a mind. And you know, on your end, y'all do the opposite. You know, you're all about the heart and the soul and the mind, and you completely forget their body. And just from a purely nervous system standpoint, I mean, think about, you know, if you're just a brain, like the way that we organize our brain as a baby even is through movement. And so a brain is just nothing. And that's how God made us, is that he put us in this body that has to move in a certain way through a developmental sequence that we all do as image bearers to organize this amazing brain. And so you cannot separate the two ever, and it is not what he intended if we do.
Yeah.
Great point.
So Tiff, let's start off just talking about this concept of when someone experiences trauma and they come to you, or sometimes they come to me and I send them to you, like we get back and forth. And they probably usually can't put this into words, but we recognize that they don't feel safe in their body. Like, I recognize why I don't feel safe in my body after 20 years of chronic pain, right? My body doesn't feel like a safe place to be because it hurts. But when they're experiencing other traumas, why might they not feel safe inside their body?
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody's experience is a little bit different, but some commonalities, you know, one can be pain, certainly, but we've all experienced of, you know, whether we want to say, I feel like I'm coming out of my skin, or I'm on edge, or I feel like I'm so tense, like why can I not settle my body? And even if they do feel safe in their exterior world, they may still not feel comfortable whatever word we want to use, they just can't get comfortable in their own body. And there can be lots of different things that may have caused that, but it's just a huge awareness that something is not right within their physical body.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So right away, one of the things I start to talk about is the window of tolerance. And I think maybe it'd be good for you to explain like what that window of tolerance is and then what is kind of happening, just in pretty layman's terms, what's happening in the nervous system when somebody's saying, I don't feel comfortable in my body.
Yeah. So I'm gonna get just a little sciencey. Y'all tell me if it's too sciencey. But there's different theories out there, and polyvagal theory is one of them, and I think we're going to talk about the vagus nerve a little bit. But basically, we have 12 cranial nerves that come off our brain and our brain stem, the base of our brain, and the 10th one is called our vagus nerve. And it's, if you ever doubted that there was a divine creator, look at this nerve. It's
Study that.
It's absolutely just amazing, and comes off your brain stem, and it's really long. It's the longest cranial nerve. And it goes through our neck and down into our body, and it supplies, the muscles that we use to swallow and talk, but then also all our heart and our lungs and goes all the way down to our lower intestine. And it splits off into two branches, and so we have a dorsal branch and a ventral branch. So ventral just means belly. Dorsal, think like dorsal fin on a fish. So dorsal means back. So it kind of splits off into these two branches. And polyvagal theory, and again, most people will agree at this point that it might be too simplistic, but it at least it's a theory. It gives us a framework to kind of understand some of these things. But we have a nervous system, an autonomic nervous system that kind of breaks up into sympathetic nervous system, and I think we've all kind of heard of that as like fight or flight, right? Mm-hmm. And then we have a parasympathetic nervous system, and we kind of refer to that as rest and digest. Mm-hmm. And 75% of our parasympathetic nervous system comes from that vagus nerve. Okay, so that vagus nerve is hugely responsible for this rest and digest. Okay, and so polyvagal theory kind of talks about kind of a ladder of, and that's what we kind of mean with this window of tolerance, whatever we want to call it. But if we're in our ventral vagal state, okay, the part of the nerve that's more in our belly, we're good. Okay, we're calm, we are present. We are where we should be. Okay. If we get on either side of that, we can get into dorsal vagal, which is, and we're going to talk about that some, I think, of just shutting down. So that's kind of almost your freeze response. That can be in the sympathetic nervous system too, but we just checked out. We are completely shut down. It's a protective mechanism to say, I cannot deal with this anymore, and I got to check out. Okay, so that's dorsal vagal. We're outside of our window of tolerance if we get into that. And then the other part of the ladder is a sympathetic response, and that's that fight or flight. We are in both of those. We are in self-preservation. Okay, and it's what God gave us. I mean, it's protective mechanisms for us, whether we need to, and it's a good thing. We need our sympathetic nervous system big time when we are in a crisis. And we need to respond very quickly, and our body knows what to do to divert our attention and our blood supply to all the things to fight or flee. Okay, and so it is a protective mechanism. But if we can't settle back down rather quickly, then we've got a problem, and we can stay outside of our window of tolerance. What should happen is, here's a simplistic example of you're walking along and somebody jumps out at you or something scares you. Okay, and your vagus nerve should really respond. And again, your heart rate's going to go up, your palms may get sweaty, your mouth may get dry. You have this big physiological response because of that vagus nerve. But you realize real quickly that you're not in danger, and you get back to baseline. And that's what we call a healthy vagal tone. Okay, so tone just means health in that situation. And so when somebody has had a lot of trauma in their life and a lot of stress, the vagal tone goes down. It gets low, and we just can't get back to that window of tolerance as quickly as we should. And a lot of people just live outside of it all the time. So does that help?
Yeah, it helps a lot. And I think since we've already introduced this idea of embodied souls and this interplay between body and soul, one of the things I like to tell people is like, being outside of our window of tolerance is not a sin, right? We have to remember, we're not talking about a sin issue here. We're talking about a physiological response that God designed in us to help us stay safe, to help us respond to danger. We can sin when we are outside of our window of tolerance, and probably many of us do have sinful responses there, right? Because we're in fight or flight. But in and of itself, our nervous system response is not sinful. And I think it's important to say that, because when the nervous system gets stuck, so to speak, and unable to easily settle back in the window of tolerance, I think people can begin to feel like there's something wrong with them, i.e. sinful with them. Not just that this is physiological, but now they begin to think that they that this is a sin issue, that this is something that God is displeased with them over, because they don't feel good.
Right. Absolutely. And it allows them to be gracious to themselves, and it allows us to be, if we understand as caregivers and family members and friends and everybody walking along with them, that their body's doing what God designed it to do. And it's an acceptable response considering the life that they've had to lead. And so it just puts us in a posture of lots of grace and mercy.
So Tiff, what are the things that you see when somebody stays in this place where their nervous system stays activated, so to speak? What are some of the effects you then see on the body?
Yeah, I mean, for what I did personally, we see this big muscular response, and so particularly as relates to pelvic floor, the medical term would be hypertonicity, and it just means spasm, basically. Is that muscle is going to respond and be overactive, and so we can see that throughout the body. But there's been so much research of just it might not show up from a musculoskeletal standpoint, but it might show up in just our general health and our immune system and our ability to fight off any kind of disease. The literature's been well established that the higher some of our adverse childhood experiences are, the more likely we are to have all sorts of things, particularly if we're not aware of it and know how to deal with it appropriately. But yeah, so I from my standpoint, I would see a lot of just dysregulated nervous system and an overactive muscle response that caused a lot of pain. Yeah.
And then things like sleep and headaches and
it just all that
kind of
compounds.
Chronic.
Yeah, all of it compounds. It makes it worse. And so it's just they get into this vicious cycle of not regulating in any way. We're not eating right. We're not sleeping right. We're not resting. We're not living in any kind of healthy way that would promote us back to a sense of calm or regulation, and you get into a vicious cycle.
Just think about how trauma does create such chaos, right? And we think about the idea of from going to chaos to rest, we have to be ordered. And so there's so much chaos. There's no order, body, soul, relationships, and that just creates so much more rest and unrest, which leads to more chaos. So we want to transition now to what would it look like for chaos to become ordered in our bodies so that we can experience rest or safety. And you talked about, dysregulation, Tiffany, in all these different ways. But one of the things that we see a lot when we're dealing with people who have had trauma is this idea of emotional dysregulation. And, we're not going to find that word in the Bible. So maybe you could help explain to us what it is, what happens, what is emotional regulation, and what is emotional dysregulation, and how does this come about?
Yeah, I think still going back to kind of that window of tolerance of if you're in that state, that ventral vagal state, you can regulate, and you can control your emotions, so to speak. But if we get on either side of that, it begins to be very difficult. And so it's beyond just like I'm a slave to my emotions. I mean, we all do that from time to time. We all have difficulty, controlling our emotions. I think when we talk about being dysregulated, this is going to be to a greater degree, and that person's going to have a harder time getting back to baseline, to where maybe, we might get mad for a minute, and we can, if we're in our ventral vagal state for the most part, and we are neurologically healthy, and emotionally healthy, then we can get back to that baseline fairly quickly. But somebody who's really dysregulated all the time and does not have a normal nervous system because of what they've been through, they can't do that as easily, and they get outside of that window of tolerance. And again, it can look like anger, it can look like crying, it can look like complete shutdown and dissociation. It depends. There can be a wide variety, and it could change even from day to day. That person can be one way one day and another way another day, but it's beyond just that ability to be, say, I'm ruled by my emotions, in my opinion.
Yeah, I like to tell people that all the good stuff happens in the window of tolerance, right? Like you said, we have this ability to problem solve and be creative and connect with other people. That's and right. Regulate ourselves, right? So like all the good stuff happens in the window of tolerance. And if we regularly find ourselves kind of knowing that a situation calls for like a level 3 response, of maybe irritability, and we're consistently jumping to an 8 in the situation. And I think we've all had that experience where we go, my reaction's not matching this situation. Right. Like it's out of proportion to what the situation calls for. And if we regularly find ourselves doing that and then unable to settle ourselves in it, then we kind of know, like, okay, we're talking about more, like you said, than just anger. We're actually talking about something that's happening in the nervous system where we can't get back into the window of tolerance easily. And so that becomes, I think sometimes when I put numbers to it, people have something they can kind of grab onto that feels a little bit more objective instead of just, I'm really angry. And so I put numbers to it for people so they can begin to gauge, okay, that was a level 5 response, but the situation probably only called for a 2. And so I need to address that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think, again, it's back to that vicious cycle, too, of, when we get outside of that window of tolerance, we don't feel safe, we disconnect, we can't socially engage, and so the situation builds rather than I can get back to my window of tolerance. I can think clearly. I can engage with people that I love, that care for me, and can co-regulate me. And so we get the cycle spinning the right way, rather than the wrong way.
Mm-hmm. Tiffany, what do you think about a person who has a lot of trauma? Do you feel like they can like wake up in the morning, they're already jacked up, so to speak? Like maybe on a scale from 1 to 10, they wake up a 5. So yes. Then when something comes along, like I might wake up at a 2 and something comes along and it takes me to a 6, let's say. Absolutely. But somebody who starts the day at a 5, same thing happens and they go to an 8.
That's right. They're already outside of the window to begin with.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
They've already jumped out the window. And so it's just gonna get worse.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what's the word? Hypervigilance. So that's that that's when the body's already staying poised for danger. Mm-hmm. And so like you said, Brenda, we wake up poised. We wake up already feeling in danger. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So Tiff, I think the hard thing is that, and I'm one of these people, that because you've treated me for, I was thinking you've been a PT for 27 years and I've been your patient for 24 of them.
I can't get you well.
I think I should get a prize for that.
You need a new PT.
I need at least a t-shirt or something. But I'm one of those people who we say is very contained. And so it can be very hard to know when someone is outside their window of tolerance when we're sitting with them. And I'm one of those people. You could sit with me and you may never know how dysregulated I am on the inside, but my pelvic floor is definitely reported on me, right? So how do we know when we're sitting with someone, like what are the signs that we're looking for that somebody's outside their window of tolerance so we can help care for them?
Yeah. I think when you're in, Alex and I talk about this all the time, like when somebody's in the sympathetic response, it can be fairly easy to recognize that's the person who is just, they look stressed out. Mm-hmm. They're not calm. They're very agitated looking. Their breath looks different. Their tone, their expressions look different. They're anxious and stressed out. When we get to that other side of that dorsal, vagal response, that kind of shutdown, if somebody has looked really agitated and angry and anxious, and they go into the shutdown mode, it can almost look like improvement. Like, right. Oh, they look so much calmer. They're not yelling at me. They're not. But if they've shut down, they're still way outside of their window of tolerance, and they can be into that dissociation kind of freeze mode. And so just being aware that can happen. I have had patients disassociate on me. It's scary. I've had a colleague who, a patient fully disassociated and relived a traumatic sexual experience as a 7-year-old right in front of her. Wow. During a physical therapy session. And, that's... traumatized the therapist too. Yeah. And so I'm always just aware of, and knowing the more you know somebody and kind of know their defaults, and when that looks outside of what they typically look like, just being aware that we can go to the other extreme. And how do we call them back out of that? And so I'm always just, I always am looking at somebody, and if they're able to be present, I don't, even during a therapy session, particularly with what we have to do with pelvic floor, if there was some trauma that was particularly sexual in nature, I don't let somebody put their AirPods in. Patients will ask that, like, can I just listen to some music? Nope, you cannot. You're gonna stay right here with me, and you're gonna have a conversation with me while we do this, because I need to be aware of your state and that you're still with me, so to speak. And so calling them back to the present, grounding them, so to speak. But sometimes it can be hard to see, but I think, again, just knowing a person and spending some time with them to know when it looks a little different. Yeah. And
some of the things I've seen you do is just say things like, how are you doing? Like you're just kind of keeping, you keep a verbal connection with them. It might not be talking about what's happening in the therapy. It might just be talking. But you'll check in. How you doing? How's this feel? Are you with me? Like, just some questions like that to get them to keep trying to verbalize. Because some people just need to ground to your voice, right? Like they need to stay in the present, and they need to hear your voice. I think with what you do, you're already engaged with touch. But I think for us, we have to be a little bit careful, because the touch barrier hasn't been broken. And so if somebody is starting to dissociate, it can feel instinctive for somebody sitting with them to want to touch them. And it's me. I want to touch somebody. I feel like that's going to bring them back into the room with me. And that that is not the thing to do. You've broken the touch barrier. You can go there. We haven't. And so we have to be really careful in that time not to reach out and touch, even if it feels instinctive for us to do that. Yeah. And so I think that's an important thing, to use your voice, use eye contact, use things like that, and not rely on touch, which can often startle people and can be very triggering to people. Yeah.
And I think too, just, calling on our senses of, I do that a lot. If I feel like I'm losing somebody a little bit, it's, what's the color of my shirt even? Yes. We're bringing our brain back online. And, what do you smell? What do you see? What do you hear? using those senses that God gave us to bring us back to the present can be also very powerful.
Yes. Yeah.
And that's really moving us in, Tiffany, kind of to the next thing we really want to talk about, like some practical practices that we can help people feel safe in their bodies again. And, and I do want to say at this point, we are body and soul. And so Alex and I talk a lot about the both and. The both and.
Yes.
The both and.
Yes.
We are not minimizing the role of the soul. And we can even talk about how to have soulish practices, if you will, with some of these physical practices. But I think sometimes when we start talking about things like grounding or breathing or some of the things we want to move into, it can set off theological alarms for some people. Like, what? They're going into Eastern religion or psychiatric practices. What's going on here? And so we want to really talk about, we want to talk. The woo-woo of it all. And so we're saying this is not woo-woo, y'all. This is like, we are talking about real ways that God has made us to interact with our bodies for the sake of our souls. Honestly, when we look at these exercises and brain hacking is what I might call them as well, or body and brain hacks, they work on in a common grace way. They'll work for anybody. But as Christians, we can actually use them to engage our faith and our trust in Jesus in a really, really practical way as we begin to exercise agency or dominion or stewardship in having good knowledge about our body and the ways that God has actually given us these warning systems, but also has given us ways to interrupt these warning systems on a physical level when they are going off the rails and no longer serving us the way that God has designed them to serve us.
Yeah.
Yes.
So that leads us a little bit into, I think the first thing we'd like to talk about is breathing and breath work. And maybe you could tell us a little bit about why is breathing important and what is happening to the body when we engage with breath work. Because I used to think this was pretty hokey, okay? Because I didn't understand. I didn't understand it.
Right. And I think if people can, again, just wrap their mind around, like, this is just basic physiology that God created. And I mean, and really, if we really think about it, it's ridiculous to think that this would not have an impact on our mood and our state. We're one body. You cannot separate the two. And so, it's just so funny to me. And I think from a more physical standpoint than the common believer in particular. But it's just it's silliness to me to think that we would not understand. But the church at large, you're right. I mean, that has always been, and I work and live in Montgomery, Alabama, in the middle of the Bible Belt, and so I'm always have to be careful with saying, that this is not woo woo. I'm not trying. This is how God made your body, and all I'm doing is trying to teach you how to enhance it and tap into that and. This is all biblical and basic physiology of how God created you. So breath work, if we kind of get back to the science of what we were talking about that vagus nerve, when we breathe through our chest, which we would call it apical breathing, we do use our chest to breathe, but really we should use our diaphragm. And so everybody understands what their diaphragm is, down here in our belly. And our chest shouldn't really come online until we do something like exercise. Okay, so, we should mostly be breathing through our diaphragm for the most part. When we start to get an elevated heart rate and respiration rate, then we start to pull in these accessory muscles, is what we would call them, from our neck and our chest that help expand our lungs and get more oxygen into our body. But we really shouldn't be breathing here just day to day. And what that does is your brain thinks when I'm breathing through my chest that I'm running or something, okay, that I'm doing the fight or flight thing. And so it says, okay, we need to gear up. And it senses that I'm in that sympathetic state, and so it brings that sympathetic nervous system back online more, okay? And it doesn't help if we breathe through our diaphragm. That brings that vagus nerve in. That brings that parasympathetic nervous system, that rest or digest. and it calms us. Okay, and so I always say that's one of the first things I teach anybody how to do is just breathe correctly. We all breathe wrong. And it's just, I think, again, it's just the world that we live in, that we all are under too much stress, and we all easily, it's common to man. And we all need to be reminded how to tap into that belly breath and calm ourselves down. And what it does to our nervous system is just absolutely amazing, and how quickly you can respond with just something so basic as your breath.
One of the stories I tell people to have happened with you, several years ago, my back went out, and I was in your office and in a lot of pain. I, at that point, had probably been practicing breathing probably for about at least a year and a half, like almost daily, doing some type of breath work. And because, again, I think we need to develop that muscle memory around what it feels like for our diet, you know, so I felt like I had done that. But I was in a lot of pain, and right before I left, you said, okay, don't forget to breathe. And I was like, yeah. And you said, no, stop and give me a good belly breath. And we stood in the doorway, and I could not do it. Like, even having practiced, but I was in pain. And my body was fighting me. Like, my body, I think, was saying, you still feel in danger because you hurt. And my body was fighting me. And I said to you, I got to go out to the car. So I went out to the car at your office. And I had to sit in the car for 3 or 4 minutes before I could get a good deep breath in my belly. And I had to sit there and breathe for a while. But it was just such a great picture to me of how even when you want to and you've practiced and you know how to do the breathing, if your body is giving signals that you feel in danger, it is going to take some time. That's right. It's going to be a lot harder. So I've had people, when I say, do you know how to breathe? And they'll say, well, I breathe every day. And I'm like, yeah, we all breathe every day. But do you know how to breathe to calm your nervous system? And we can even know how to do it, but when the body's activated, it's going to fight us a little bit, and it's going to take some time to get the breath all the way down into the belly and to feel the exhale all the way down through the pelvis. And so it was just such a great example to me in my own body of like, I know how to do this, and I can't do it.
Yeah, and it can get a little worse before it gets better too, because if you don't know how to, you'll almost feel like you're hyperventilating a little bit. You know, if you've had an irregular breathing pattern for a while, it can take a minute before you get it. And again, it's muscle, it's tissue that has to learn and expand and change, just like any other muscle. And so it takes a little time there as well. Yep.
Tiff, is it true that I've been reading some that when we are down and collapse and freeze, the hypo-arousal, we actually have to get a little bit activated to come into the window of tolerance. And breath, we can actually do activating breaths. So there are relaxing breaths, but there are also activating breaths.
Correct.
Yeah.
And that can be the wisdom of kind of knowing where somebody is. And sometimes that we need to move. We need to, we need to excite them a little bit to kind of pull them out of that dorsal vagal state. Where if we're in a sympathetic response, we need to do things that calm and co-regulate. But sometimes the answer is we need to excite you a little bit, and you need to move. You know, yeah.
And I've been watching people a little bit. I hope a little bit more carefully, and even suggesting that sometimes when we're in the middle of a counseling session, if I see them either seemingly I'm starting to feel like I'm losing them, or if they're getting very agitated, I'm more and more suggesting, do you want to get up and walk around the office? Do you want to get up and walk around outside with me? Yes. And just not thinking we have to stay in this little room and have them squirm in their body, but just letting them, express some of that through movement sometimes has been helpful.
Absolutely.
Well, not that we have to overly spiritualize everything, but I do want to bring to our attention. First of all, when we talk about breath, the Hebrew and Greek words for breath are also spirit. And so I do think it is just interesting that God had breathed life into us, spiritual and physical, and now we can use breath work to help us physically and spiritually. And I think one of the ways that is really neat to use breath work, particularly once you understand, because I really like to take people through a process of understanding how to breathe first on the physical before we maybe add something spiritual in, because I think as Christians particularly, we want to jump straight to the spiritual when it's like, no, I really want you to understand like what belly breathing is and those sort of things. But I think that using an ancient practice of breath prayer can be really, really helpful. We can begin to tie our breathing to Bible verses of inhale and exhaling, or we can inhale a word of hope and exhale a word of confession maybe, or something that we are surrendering or releasing. And so I think breath work really becomes a way to be reminded that God is with us, that he's watching over us, that he cares for us, that he sees our body, he hears what's going on, he's moving toward us. I think it can just be that moment that we can take to really reflect spiritually as we actually pull away and calm ourselves physically as well. And so one of the questions I did have, and maybe we could just do these as some handouts, and rather than taking time here, Tiffany, but maybe you could share with us some of your favorite breathing exercises for both hypo and hyper arousal, and we could put together a little handout and maybe even some apps you might use. I know that there are a lot of apps these days that can be really helpful with showing us why and how and the counting and all of that. So maybe we won't take time in this podcast because I know we need to move on, but I'd love for you to help us do that. There's so much out there. I know as I've gotten on the internet, I mean, there's tons of videos and there are tons of apps, and it can feel very overwhelming. Talk about now I'm panicking over the fact I can't figure out how to breathe. Or I can't figure these things out. Which one of these is working? And now I am hyperventilating. But let's move on to just another way that we have touched on, but maybe drilling down a little bit more on this idea of grounding, what it is and how we do it and why it's important.
Yeah, one thing I want to say about the breath also too is when we do something like what you were talking about, of using an app or using scripture or prayer, and the other thing that does, and again, a lot of people will, when I use this word, you're going to think woo-woo immediately, but it's a mindfulness practice, and that's had negative connotation in the church, but it's the grounding part. It's the being present. And so when I force myself to focus, that is a discipline that calms me down. And because again, what you guys know, anxiety is living out here and not being present with my current situation. And so if I establish a discipline of focusing on my breath and focusing on whether it be words or scripture or counting, okay, whatever we want it to be, and my mind starts to wander, and then I pull it back, and I'm building discipline and muscle memory, so to speak, of controlling that. And that's all grounding and mindfulness is I'm living out here and it's producing negative emotion in me, and how do I bring it back to where I am now? And that's one of the ways to do it, is to focus on my body and where I am in space. Where is my breath? Where is my mind and my thought? What is the discipline practice that I'm going to do to bring it back to, whether it be counting or just focusing on my breath or scripture? Again, so many apps to do that. And like we were talking about, bringing in your senses of what do I see? What do I smell? What do I taste? What do I feel? That brings me all back to being in the present. Getting out into nature, that's so important, of being out in God's creation. And it's so easy to, like, you could just go for a walk and you realize you walked the whole time and you didn't focus on one thing of what you could see, what you could smell, what you could hear, what you could feel, what you could taste. Just being aware of being in God's creation. It's just so powerful, and it's so simple. All these things are so simple that God gave us.
They're just at our fingertips and disposal, and we don't even acknowledge them. I think about just how what you said, how emotional overwhelm, emotional dysregulation, feeling very overwhelmed, feeling flooded, really tempts us to either get stuck in our past, right? Like we go backwards with regret and fear and all that, or we race ahead toward the future. And just what you're saying is that when we ground ourselves, we're staying present. And this is where God is. God is in our present. This is where God's in our past, our present, and our future. But where he wants us to meet him today is in our present. He's our ever-present help in trouble. He's present here.
Oh, and that's where his grace is. His grace
That's right. His grace is here in this
now.
moment. Yeah, the grace for this moment. And I read a beautiful article by Mike Emlet and some things by Todd Stride. We'll post these articles as well because they were really beautiful about just breath work and about embodied souls. And Dr. Mike Emlet is a physician who also is a counselor, but one of the things he just talked about is how our five senses help us experience the love of God and his goodness. And so again, kind of taking this idea of grounding and moving it maybe a little bit more into an acknowledgement of God, but like the sound of music, like God, thank you for the like ears and the beautiful music. The smell of a baby. I'm smelling this little baby, and she just smells so good. I say that because I have a little newborn grandbaby, and she just smells so good. But that keeps me present, right? Or the feeling of a cold or warm water, how that, like this, Lord, thank you for this. The smell of fresh cookies, or the taste of cookies, or seeing the fall colors change. Like God has given us so many things. And I guess one of the things that, if I understand, like fight, flight kind of narrows, right? Like our vision. And we get that tunnel vision. And so to be able to engage all of our senses as a way to acknowledge that we are, like when Paul says, be rooted and grounded in the love of God, I'm thinking that rooting and grounding in the love of God is acknowledging the goodness of God, his presence, and all that he's given to us to be present with us in this moment. And just one example that Mike Emlet gave I thought was so good. He said that he has a collection of stones in his office, and he'll invite a person to like touch and hold it, and then they'll talk about how God is like the rock, what it means that he's strong, he's immovable, you can hide behind the rock. And again, just using something very tactile
and stuff too.
Yeah, and I think about, this idea of embodied souls, Tiffany, and I know, I'm wondering with your BrainPump if you see this, but we are becoming so disembodied, right? Like everything we do is technology, or there's so much technology that's taking over. There's, I don't know, maybe speak even just a little bit to that. I'd be curious to know your thoughts on, like, we are living more disembodied.
For sure.
And so we don't even think about doing these things.
Yeah, and particularly in children, I mean, that's what we see. That's we don't know all that's going on, but it's certainly one of the theories as why we're seeing more of these, sensory issues and developmental delay is that children just go straight to screens. And so, I mean, maybe even as if we were kids and we watched too much TV, we still went outside and we played. And, now kids, we have too much baby equipment, and they don't move around normally as a newborn. We stick them in all this different baby equipment, and so they're not on the floor moving around like we're supposed to. And then again, even if we did that as infants and stayed, say, in a stroller too much or whatever, we still we righted the wrongs, so to speak, because we went outside and we played. And now kids just go from one to the other. And so again, remember, we can't organize our brains without movement. That is how we do it. And that we are the only species that goes through a developmental sequence. I mean, isn't that amazing? And no other species really does that. And so we have to go through developmental sequence of those milestones because our brain absolutely requires it. Because we have a higher brain that is made in the image of God. And we have to move. It is so, so, so important. And so mothers, if you hear nothing else, nobody's trying to hurt their baby, but, put that baby on the floor, on their tummy, and let them move and crawl, and then, get them off of those screens and outside playing, moving their body. That is how we develop our brain. It is not just about weight management and cardiovascular health. It is neurological. So it's, yes, we're getting farther and farther away from it. You see schools, that's always my pet peeve. We go to schools a lot, and and speak to administrators and people, policymakers, and speaking at conferences. And it's like, where did your playgrounds go? Like, you go to schools all the time and there's no swings. Like, where's the swings? And it's because, even that, like swinging, just basic swinging calms your nervous system for 8 hours. 15 minutes of linear swinging stays in your nervous system for 8 hours. But where did all our swings go? And so, somebody got sued because an arm was broken or whatever. And again, I'm not discrediting that real injuries don't happen, but what the lack of that is doing to the population at large is much worse.
So how does that translate to movement with people who have experienced trauma? If our listeners are professionals, but also, lay people, just Christians in the pew that are wanting to help their neighbor, what would be some ways that you would encourage us to help a person coming out of trauma with movement?
Yeah, I think just encouraging them, to move even with you, of going for a walk and calling them back to the present, and, getting out in nature and getting off of technology, and that idea of co-regulation. And we haven't talked about that, but just it's such a gift to be able to sit with someone, and that's where our nervous systems talk to each other without even talking to each other. It's absolutely amazing that that vagus nerve, it is our sixth sense. And and that's what I'm always trying to teach young therapists. It's like, You've already made an impression when you walk in a room with a patient before you ever speak a word. And if I'm regulated, then I have the ability to regulate somebody else. If I'm not regulated myself and I'm running around with my hair on fire and I'm 15 minutes behind and I'm thinking about my last patient or what I'm going to cook for dinner that night, I have no ability to regulate somebody else. And so to calm myself first, and to step into a room and to realize what a privilege it is for our nervous systems to talk to each other. And it's an amazing, amazing thing. And so we have the ability to do that for each other, and that's community. And it's such an amazing thing. And with me, I'm telling PT students all the time too, like, you might be the only person who touched that person today. There may be nobody else in their life that is touching them, and it is a privilege to be able to touch another person. And so it's just a very powerful thing. Yeah,
I think that I was just going to say, I think that's interesting you say that, because I think in the soulish realm it's the same, right? Like, you might have an encounter with somebody and you might be the only person that this person is invited into their trauma, or the only person that's going to give them an encouraging word or just be present with them today, and just the power of that.
Yes. Yeah.
And I want to just make one clarification, because when we are talking about, because we're going to talk in a couple of episodes about telling your trauma story and helping someone tell their trauma story. And so when we're talking about staying present, we don't mean that we're forcing somebody to always talk about the present. We're talking about staying mindful. Again, it's a word some people don't like, but mindful. So even when someone is sharing their trauma story with us that may have happened in the past, are they able to be present in that story, mindful in that story with us, not dissociated in their nervous system, not going into freeze or collapse? And if they're not, then we can bring some co-regulation to that. We can check in. Are you okay? Do we need to breathe for a minute? So we're not saying that we only allow people to talk about what's happening in the present. I think that maybe that's obvious, but I want to make sure we say it. We're saying that even in the way we tell our story about the past, we want our body to stay in the room, so to speak, because what trauma can do is that it wants us to believe it's back there. It's still experiencing that. And so we want the body to be able to recognize it's still safe, and it can tell the story of the danger that happened back there, but recognize its safety in the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, just of an awareness of teaching people of where they feel things in their body. It's just so powerful, that we dissociate our head from our body, and we don't even realize that we are feeling things in our body. And so just bringing an awareness to where do you feel that tension, and what does it feel like, and can we do some strategies that begin to reduce that? Because that's that seems again so basic, but people don't realize until you call attention to it that they are feeling this in their body. And so just so much, again, we tend to do, neck up therapy and neck down therapy, and we have to bridge that gap more and more.
Yeah, can you say one thing, Tiff, about how, I know that we could do a whole podcast on this, I know, but maybe give just a little example when somebody says trauma stored in the body, or the body's keeping the score. Just what's like a simple example of how you've seen that play out? I
mean, again, with me, it's more of that muscle tension, and a lot of people will poo-poo that of, the body kind of keeps the score. But again, if of course it does. I mean, we have physical responses to emotions all the time. That's what crying is. That is a physiological response to an emotion. We do it in all kinds of ways. And so, that's a very naive understanding of the nervous system, in my opinion, to think that we're not going to have a physiological response to an emotion. And if we do that enough, our body it defaults. It can't forget it. It has a harder time moving on from that, and we begin to get a pattern. And we see that in therapy all the time. There's just patterns that develop on how we live our life. And emotions are part of that too. So I've seen that 1,000 times, and it's very odd. I mean, sometimes I'll be releasing a certain muscle in somebody's hip or belly or pelvic floor, and they'll just start crying, and they don't know why. And I don't know exactly what physiologically is happening either. I mean, I don't know that trauma was stored right in that muscle, but there was some kind of release that happened that released some emotion as well. And I've seen it 100 times. And it's odd, and I can't explain it, but it happens.
I really like, Tiffany, when you're talking about, recognizing the feelings of overwhelm in our bodies. And then also, it reminds me just the importance of being able to name the feelings we feel. We use the little feelings chart, because so often when we go into overwhelm, we can't say how we feel. I just am overwhelmed. But kind of that name it to tame it, if we can begin to name some of those emotions, and if we can begin to identify how it's making us feel, then we can begin to act on, and because the Bible has something to say from an emotional standpoint about every emotion we feel. And from a physiological standpoint, there are things we can do to help regulate our bodies depending on how our bodies are responding to that emotion. Like we said, we're going into fight flight in a hypo or hyper arousal state. But the last thing we really want to talk about, just in terms of things that might help, and certainly our list is not maybe all there is, but a few good things, is just this idea of moving people toward beauty and how beauty impacts us. And that beauty might come in a lot of different forms, but maybe you could speak to that for us.
Yeah, I mean, I think certainly some of what we've already talked about, of just being out in nature and finding what is beautiful to you. I mean, that can be a lot of different things, from music to art to nature to people. God gives us all kinds of things that we find beauty in, and I think that is really important. And again, it brings us back to that grounding. I think other things, singing, and that's what's so interesting too. Like even just humming. It stimulates your vagus nerve. I mean, it's gargling. I mean, it's so strange, just humming music, and then particularly if that music has some positive, powerful influence, and it brings back a positive memory. You humming raises the tone of your vagal nerve, and so just again, certain sounds music stimulates certain areas of our brain that brings our parasympathetic nervous system back online. Cold exposure, I mean, that's been like all the rage, but that's always been around in terms of there's nothing that's going to bring you back into the present like some really cold water. But it's that discipline. It kind of puts you in that sympathetic response, and then you have to have the discipline of calming yourself. And so, all of these things can be helpful. But yes, beauty is so powerful, and it can mean different things to different people. But finding what does bring you beauty and being present in that is so powerful.
Tiff, I like that you're saying the discipline of calming yourself, because I think a lot of people think when they get activated and they're in fight or flight, I'm just going to knuckle down and I'm going to push through. And what a lot of times what that means is they're going to knuckle down and push through in fight or flight.
Right.
And they think that's going to get me better, like that. I've just got to pull myself up from my bootstrap. And I think it's really important to say that actually the discipline that we need is to learn to calm ourselves, because we don't expand our window of tolerance by knuckling down and just going deeper into fight or flight to accomplish a task in front of us. Sometimes we have to if we're in real danger.
Yeah.
But what really expands our window of tolerance, and in other words, helps us develop more resilience, is to develop the discipline of learning to calm our nervous system. And so all of these things don't just calm us in the moment, but they actually help us develop resilience for the next hard thing.
That's right. That tolerance gets bigger, and that is the feel your feels. I mean, and that's where we go a little sideways sometimes of like, I'm going to just ignore what I'm feeling in my mind and in my body, and push through. And that oftentimes makes things worse, rather than we have a toolbox. We can feel our feels, and we can determine where we feel it in our body, and then we have these strategies that begin to bring our nervous system back to a window of tolerance, bring our parasympathetic nervous system back online. And then again, we've got the wheel spinning in the right way, and we actually can think a little clearly at that point, because we're back inside the house, not jumping out the window.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's why we wanted to start today with the body, because we wanted to recognize that we really do many times have to start with the body if we're going to think well about God and think well about relationships, which is going to be our next 2 podcasts. Then we're going to have to be able to think. And if that's offline, then we can't do that. So that's why we wanted to start with the body. It's not that we're, trying to place more importance over one thing or the other, but we are recognizing, because of the way God designed us, in order for our brain to think well, even to remember the things about God that we know, to remember that Bible verse, or remember that visual theology or something that we've built in, we're going to have to be able to calm the nervous system to be able to access that in the brain. And so that's why I wanted to start with the body, and I just can't think of a better person to take us there than you have today.
Thank you. I have enjoyed it. I really appreciate you guys having me.
Yeah, thank you, Tiffany. We're definitely going to have you back. I think we've got a lot I think we've been challenged by a lot today, and I really hope that we will be able to implement some of these things, and also just to provide more handouts. I want to say that we'll have some handouts that we will attach, some articles we will attach, because maybe this is your first time of hearing of some of these things or hearing them in a theological framework. And sometimes we just need to spending more time understanding what this idea of calming our body looks like, so that our bodies and soul can be connected, and we can really use our bodies in a way that will better glorify God, better be prepared to serve Him and honor Him. And that's really what we're about and what we want to do. So thanks so much for all your expertise. We love you. We appreciate you, and we look forward to having you back on.
Same. Thank y'all.